Mail-order bride rejected for her scarred face. Until a blind rancher asked for her hand, she traveled 1,000 miles to be a bride, but one look at her scarred face, and he walked away without a word, leaving her stranded at a dusty train station with nothing but a carpet bag and 27 years of rejection. The train's whistle died into the Texas heat like a prayer nobody answered. Clara Whitmore stepped down onto the wooden platform of Dust Ridge Station, her worn boots finding uncertain purchase on the sun-bleached planks. The carpetbag in her left hand held everything she owned in this world. The shawl pulled tight across her right cheek held everything she feared. Dust hung in the air like suspended time, and through it, she saw him. Robert McKinnon stood exactly where his letter had promised, near the water barrel, wearing a brown hat and a look of expectation that would soon turn to something else entirely. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she walked toward her future husband, each step carrying 27 years of hope and the weight of a secret she'd tried to bury in careful penmanship. She had written him beautiful letters, words that painted her as whole, unmarked, worthy of the love a lonely rancher might offer a mail-order bride. She had described her cooking, her sewing, her church attendance. She had told him about her father's small farm in Ohio, about her gentle nature, about her willingness to work hard and love faith. But she had never mentioned the fire that had claimed half her childhood and left its signature burned into her face like God's own brand of unworthiness. Robert's eyes found her approaching figure, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, Clara saw something that might have been relief. A woman had answered his advertisement. Someone had come. But then her shawl shifted in the hot wind, and the late afternoon sun caught the twisted flesh that ran from her right temple to her jaw, the skin that had melted and healed in ridges and valleys that no amount of prayer had ever smoothed. His face changed like weather. The relief drained away, replaced by something worse than disgust, a kind of weary disappointment, as if he'd been expecting this particular cruelty from a world that had already dealt him plenty of hard hands. He looked at her for perhaps 10 seconds longer, his gaze moving from her scarred cheek to her eyes and back again, and Clara felt her soul shrink under his assessment. Then Robert McKinnon turned around and walked away. He didn't say a word. No greeting, no explanation, no apology for the letters they'd exchanged or the promises implied in ink and hope. He simply mounted his horse, tipped his hat to the station master, and rode out of Dust Ridge in the direction of whatever life he'd been living before a scarred woman had dared to dream of sharing it. Clara stood frozen on the platform, her carpetbag suddenly feeling like an anchor dragging her down through the earth. The few other passengers who had disembarked were already being collected by their people. A young mother swept into the arms of a weathered farmer, 2 businessmen shaking hands with local merchants. An elderly couple helped into a waiting buggy by their son. The platform emptied like water through a broken dam, leaving Clara alone with the station master and the terrible silence of abandonment. "You all right, miss?" The station master's voice carried the careful kindness of someone who had witnessed this particular tragedy before. His eyes didn't linger on her scars, but she could feel his pity like heat from a stove. "I'm fine," Clara lied, the words tasting like dust in her mouth. She pulled the shawl tighter and walked to the wooden bench that faced the tracks, just resting a moment. But she wasn't resting. She was drowning in the familiar weight of rejection, in the understanding that it followed her from Ohio like a faithful dog. Beautiful letters meant nothing when you carried your shame on your face. Kind words and gentle promises couldn't survive the shock of twisted flesh and dreams burned down to their foundations. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of old blood and forgotten hopes. Clara sat on that bench and watched the light die over Texas, thinking about the fire that had taken everything from her when she was 7 years old. Her mother had been baking bread when the kitchen caught, and Clara had run toward the flames instead of away, trying to save the kitten that had been sleeping by the warm stove. Her father had pulled her out, but not before the fire had written its story across her face in letters that would never fade. For 20 years after that day, Clara had learned the weight of stares and whispers. She had grown up knowing that other girls got invited to dances while she got invited to help in the kitchen. She had watched her friends marry and start families while she tended her aging parents and accepted the quiet assumption that some people were meant to walk through this world alone. The mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like salvation. A chance to start over in a place where nobody knew her story, where she could be judged by her letters instead of her face. She had saved every penny for the train ticket, had written and rewritten her responses to Robert's inquiries, had even allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be wanted despite everything. Now she sat on a bench in Dustridge, Texas, watching the last light die, and understood that geography couldn't outrun the truth written in scarred flesh. 1,000 miles hadn't been far enough. Nothing ever would be. The station master locked up his office as full darkness settled over the town. "There's a boarding house down Main Street," he offered quietly. "Mrs. Henderson runs a clean place. Decent prices." Clara nodded her thanks, but didn't move. She had $17 left after the train ticket, enough for maybe a week of room and board. And then what? She couldn't go home. Her parents' farm had been sold to pay their debts before they died. She had no family, no friends, no prospects in a town where her intended husband had taken one look and decided she wasn't worth a single spoken word. But she sat there as the stars emerged overhead, bright and cold and impossibly distant. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound carried all the loneliness of the frontier. Clara touched her scarred cheek through the thin fabric of her shawl and wondered if this was how her story was meant to end. Alone on a bench in a place that wasn't home, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the terrible certainty that some wounds never healed, no matter how much time passed or how many miles you traveled to escape them. But as she sat there in the gathering darkness, something moved in the shadows beyond the platform. The footsteps came slow and careful across the wooden planks, accompanied by the soft tap of something against the ground. Clara lifted her head from her hands and saw a man emerge from the shadows, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes that spoke of honest labor and a hat pulled low against the night air. He moved with deliberate precision, and it took her a moment to understand why. The walking stick in his left hand swept gently from side to side, finding the edges of the platform, the location of the bench, the shape of the world he couldn't see. Thomas Brennan was blind. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man comfortable with silence. He stopped a respectful distance away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to give her space to breathe. Couldn't help but notice someone was still here. "Station's been closed for near an hour now." Clara pulled her shawl tighter, an automatic gesture that meant nothing to a man who lived in perpetual darkness. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to linger. I'll be moving along. No need to apologize." Thomas shifted slightly, his head tilted in that particular way of people who listen with their whole being. "Mind if I ask if you're all right? You sound like someone who's had their world knocked sideways." There was something in his tone, not pity, not curiosity, but a kind of recognition that spoke of his own acquaintance with hard fortune. Clara found herself studying his face in the pale starlight, seeing the crow's feet around his closed eyes, the weathered skin of a man who spent his days under the Texas sun, the careful stillness of someone who had learned to read the world through senses most people never bothered to develop. "I'm fine," she said again, the lie coming easier this time. "Just waiting something I know about." Thomas leaned against his walking stick, settling in like a man with time to spare. "Been doing plenty of it myself these past few years." Sometimes a person finds out that waiting alone ain't much different from waiting with company, except company makes the time pass a little easier. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, some small knot of tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. When was the last time someone had simply offered to wait with her, without wanting anything in return, without looking at her like she was something broken that needed fixing or avoiding? "You don't know me," she said quietly. "That's true enough." Thomas nodded toward the bench. "Mind if I sit?" Been on my feet most of the day, and these old bones could use the rest. She moved over to make room, and he settled beside her with the careful grace of a man who navigated by touch and sound. This close, she could smell the honest scent of leather and horses, soap and sun-warmed cotton. There was something deeply comforting about his presence, solid, unhurried, requiring nothing from her but the simple courtesy of shared space. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, listening to the night sounds of Dust Ridge settling into sleep. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A night bird called from the direction of the creek. The wind moved through the scattered buildings like a whispered conversation. "I'm Thomas Brennan," he said eventually. "Got a ranch about 5 miles south of town. Small operation. Cattle, horses, enough to keep a man busy. Clara Whitmore." The name felt strange on her tongue, like she was introducing someone she'd never been before coming to Texas. "Clara." He repeated it like he was tasting the sound. "That's a good name. Strong. My grandmother was named Clara." "Was she?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to phrase the question. "Beautiful." Thomas smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered face entirely. "Grandest woman who ever drew breath, according to my grandfather. Had a laugh that could charm birds out of trees and hands that could heal anything that ailed you. Lost her sight when she was 43. Fever took it, but she always said that was when she learned to see what really mattered." Clara felt her throat tighten. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She lived another 30 years after that, and some of the happiest times of her life came in those later years. Used to tell me that when the good Lord closed one door, he had a way of opening windows you never knew were there. Thomas turned his face toward her, and though his eyes didn't focus, she had the strange sensation that he was seeing her more clearly than anyone ever had. "What brought you to Dust Ridge, Clara Whitmore?" The question hung in the air between them, gentle but persistent. Clara found herself looking at this man who couldn't see her scars, who had no way of judging her by the twisted flesh that had defined her entire adult life. And for the first time in years, she felt the possibility of telling the truth. "I came to be married," she said simply, "to a man named Robert McKinnon. We've been corresponding for months." And he took one look at me and rode away without saying a word. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on his walking stick, his face thoughtful. "That tells me more about Robert McKinnon than it does about you," he said finally. "You don't understand." Clara's voice broke slightly. "I'm not. I'm scarred. Badly. From a fire when I was a child." "My face." She touched her cheek through the shawl. "It's not something a person can overlook." "Can it?" Thomas asked quietly. "Seems to me that if a man judges a woman by her face alone, he's not much of a man to begin with. Good thing you found that out before you married him." Clara stared at him, this stranger who spoke of her rejection like it might have been a blessing in disguise. "You don't know what it's like," she whispered, "to carry something like this. To know that people see you coming and look away. To understand that you'll never be chosen, never be wanted, never be loved because of something that happened when you were 7 years old." Thomas turned toward her fully then, his expression serious. "You're right. I don't know what that's like. But I know what it's like to have your whole life change in a single moment. To lose the thing you thought defined you. To wake up one day and discover that the world sees you different than you see yourself." "Ow!" The word came out barely above a breath. "Stampede, 3 years back. Got caught between my horse and a spooked steer. When I woke up, the light was gone forever." He was quiet for a moment. "First year was the hardest. Kept reaching for things that weren't where I expected them to be. Kept trying to see sunsets and faces and all the things I thought mattered. And now," Thomas smiled again, that same transformation that seemed to light his entire face from within. "Now I know that sunsets are in the cool breeze on your skin and the sound of cattle settling down. Faces are in the way a person's voice changes when they smile, the rhythm of their breathing when they're content or worried or afraid. The important things, they were never in my eyes to begin with." Clara felt tears start to burn behind her eyelids. "But people still see you as whole. As a man. I'm just damaged. Are you? Thomas shifted slightly, turning more fully toward her. Or are you a woman who's learned things that whole people never have to learn? Strength that comes from surviving what others couldn't? Compassion born from understanding what it means to hurt. His words hit her like physical blows, each one striking against the wall she'd built around her heart. You don't even know me. No, he agreed. But I'd like to. The simple statement hung between them, honest and without expectation. Clara stared at this man who couldn't see her ruined face, who spoke to her like she was worth knowing, worth spending time with, worth the gentle patience in his voice. I don't have anywhere to go, she said finally, the admission scraping against her pride like sandpaper. No money for more than a few days at the boarding house. No family. No prospects. Thomas nodded slowly. Well then, seems like you might be willing to consider a proposition. Clara's stomach clenched. She'd heard propositions before, usually whispered by men who thought a scarred woman should be grateful for any attention at all. I need a housekeeper, Thomas continued, his tone matter-of-fact and businesslike. Someone to help with the cooking, the mending, keeping things organized. Woman who ran my household died last winter. Pneumonia took her, and I've been making do on my own ever since. House shows it, and so do I. Clara blinked, caught off guard by the practical offer. You're offering me work, room, board, and fair wages for honest. Nothing more, nothing less. Thomas stood, using his walking stick to find his balance. Think about it tonight. If you're interested, I'll be here tomorrow morning around 8 to take you out to see the place. He started to walk away, then paused and turned back. Clara, yes, that fire you mentioned? The one that scarred you. What about it? Thomas was quiet for a moment, his face thoughtful in the starlight. Seems to me that fire did two things. It marked you, yes. But it also proved something about the kind of person you are, someone brave enough to run toward danger to save something helpless. Most people spend their whole lives never being tested like, never knowing what they're truly made of. He tipped his hat and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara alone on the bench with his words echoing in her mind, and, for the first time in years, the strange, fragile sensation of hope beginning to unfurl in her chest like a flower that had forgotten how to bloom. The morning sun painted golden stripes across Thomas McKenna's kitchen floor, but he moved through them by memory and touch, his fingers finding the coffee tin without hesitation. 3 days had passed since the woman appeared at his door, and the rhythm of his solitary life had shifted to accommodate another heartbeat in his home. Clara sat at his wooden table, her damaged hands wrapped around a tin cup, watching him navigate his world with quiet precision. She had not spoken her name until the second day, and even then, it came as barely a whisper, as if she feared the sound might shatter something fragile between them. The coffee's strong, she said, her voice still carrying the rasp of someone who had screamed too much and cried too little. Thomas smiled, settling into the chair across from her. My late wife used to say I made it strong enough to wake the dead. Never did learn the gentler way of brewing. The mention of his wife hung in the air like morning mist. Clara studied his face, weathered but kind, with lines that spoke of laughter as much as sorrow. His sightless eyes looked past her, but somehow she felt more seen than she had in years. How long, she asked, since Martha passed? For years come autumn. His fingers found the handle of his cup. The blindness came before that. Accident with a wild horse. Kicked me square in the head when I was young and foolish enough to think I could break any bronch that drew breath. Clara's hand moved instinctively to the scars that marked her throat like a necklace of pain. Did it change how people looked at you? Thomas was quiet for a moment, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside his window. Can't say how people look at me now. But I remember the pity in their voices at first. The way they spoke louder, as if losing sight had made me deaf. The way they assumed I couldn't do for myself. He sipped his coffee. What I learned was that some folks see with their hearts, and others see only what they expect to find. She understood. In town, she had felt the weight of stares, the whispered conversations that followed her like shadows. Her scars told a story she did not want to share, painted her as something broken beyond repair. "I can work," she said suddenly. "I'm not looking for charity." "Didn't figure you were." Thomas rose and moved to the window, his hand finding the frame with practiced ease. "Ranch this size, there's always work for willing hands. Fences need mending, chickens need tending, and the vegetable garden's gone to ruin since Martha died." Her hands knew how to coax life from stubborn ground. Clara joined him at the window, careful to keep space between them. Outside, she could see the ranch stretching toward distant hills, pastures where cattle grazed, a weathered barn that leaned slightly to the east, corrals that needed new posts. It was a place that spoke of hard work and honest living, of dreams built board by board. "I don't know much about cattle," she admitted. "I don't know much about seeing anymore," Thomas replied. "But we both know about getting through each day. Sometimes that's enough to start with." The first week passed in careful steps around each other's pain. Clara mended the chicken coop, her scarred fingers proving surprisingly nimble with hammer and nail. She discovered that work could be a kind of prayer, each fixed board a small act of faith that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. Thomas taught her the rhythm of ranch life, when to feed the animals, how to read the sky for weather, where to find the eggs that stubborn hens hid in unlikely places. He moved through his world with a confidence that amazed her, his hands reading stories in the texture of wood, the warmth of an animal's flank, the direction of the wind. In the evenings, they sat on his porch as the sky turned from blue to purple to black. Clara would describe the sunset to him, the way the light caught the edges of clouds, how the mountains looked like sleeping giants against the horizon. In return, he shared memories of this land from before his sight was taken, painting pictures with words of seasons he could no longer see but still felt in his bones. "The first snow always comes earlier than you expect," he said one evening, rocking slowly in his chair. "But the ground holds warmth longer than it should. Makes for a fog that rolls across the pastures like a living thing." Clara pulled her shawl tighter against the cooling air. "I've never seen snow." "Not real snow. Where are you from?" The question came gently, without demand. She was quiet, so long he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "Nowhere I want to remember." He nodded as if this was answer enough. It was during the second week that Clara found the books. She was cleaning his small parlor when she discovered them hidden beneath dust and neglect, volumes of poetry, their leather covers worn soft by many hands. She opened one carefully, reading words that seemed to capture the ache of beauty she felt but could never speak. That evening, she asked, "Would you like me to read to you?" Thomas's face lit with something approaching joy. "Martha used to read to me. Haven't heard poetry in 4 years." Clara's voice shook at first, rusty from disuse and uncertainty. But as she read about distant shores and endless skies, about love that endured beyond sight and touch, her voice grew stronger. The words flowed between them like a river finding its course, carrying more than meaning, carrying connection. "You have a beautiful voice," Thomas said when she finished the first poem. Clara's hand moved to her throat, to the scars that had nearly stolen her voice forever. "It's broken." "No," he said firmly. "It's different. There's truth in it that perfect voices don't carry. Pain has made it deeper, more honest." She looked at him sitting in his chair, his face turned toward her in the lamplight, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the sharp crack of more breaking, but the slow, warm spread of something beginning to heal. For the first time since arriving at his door, she allowed herself to imagine staying. Not just for a few days or weeks, but long enough to plant something in the garden come spring. Long enough to see if this feeling growing between them was real or just the gratitude of a wounded animal for shelter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and whispering promises of the winter to come. Clara closed the book and looked at Thomas, who sat listening to sounds she was only learning to hear. The language of a land that spoke in weather and seasons, in the movement of animals and the turning of the earth. Tomorrow would bring new work, new small acts of building something together. But tonight, in the golden circle of lamplight, two broken souls sat in comfortable silence, beginning to understand that healing might be possible after all. The question that hung unspoken between them was not whether they could survive the winter ahead, but whether they had the courage to believe that broken things, when mended together, might prove stronger than they ever were alone. She spent years believing her scars made her unlovable, until she watched her blind husband teach their daughter that the most beautiful things in life can only be felt with the heart. Spring came to the Brennan Ranch like a whispered promise kept. Clara stood at the kitchen window, her hand resting on the gentle swell beneath her apron, watching Thomas guide their horse through the morning routine. 6 months had passed since their simple wedding. 6 months of learning that love could grow in the quiet spaces between words, in the touch of hands that knew each other's scars. The morning sickness had been her first sign, followed by a tenderness in her body that spoke of new life taking root. When she told Thomas, he had gone very still, his weathered hands reaching for hers across the breakfast table. "A child," he had whispered, wonder filling his voice like sunrise. "Clara, are you certain?" She had guided his hands to rest against her belly, where the smallest flutter of movement had begun to make itself known. "As certain as I've ever been about any." Thomas had wept then, tears sliding down his cheeks as he pressed his forehead against their joined hands. "I never thought. After Martha, I believed that part of my life was finished." "Nothing is finished," Clara had said, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "Everything is just beginning." Now, as spring painted the world in shades of green and gold, Clara felt the truth of those words in every cell of her changing body. The child grew strong within her, and with each passing day, she felt herself growing stronger too. The woman who had arrived broken and bleeding at Thomas's door was becoming someone new, not unmarked by pain, but transformed by it. Thomas was teaching her to see the ranch through his other senses. "Listen," he would say as they walked among the cattle. "That low sound means the herd is content. But hear how different it is when the wind shifts? They're catching scent of something that makes them uneasy." Clara learned to read the sky through the behavior of birds, to predict weather by the way the horses held their ears, to know which plants would thrive by the texture of soil between her fingers. Thomas's world was not smaller than the sighted world. It was deeper, richer with meaning that eyes alone could never capture. When the apple trees bloomed, Clara described their beauty with words that had grown poetic through months of evening readings. "The petals are like snow, but warmer somehow. Pink-white and so delicate they seem to glow in the morning light. Can you bring me a branch?" Thomas asked. She broke off a small flowering branch and placed it in his hands. He held it gently, his fingers exploring each petal, breathing in its scent. "Now I see it," he said, smiling, "better than I ever did with my eyes." Their daughter arrived on a morning when the meadowlarks were singing and the grass was heavy with dew. Clara's labor began before dawn, waves of pain that seemed to echo the rhythm of the earth itself. Ancient, natural, necessary. Thomas stayed beside her throughout, his hands steady and sure as he helped bring their child into the world. When the baby's first cry pierced the morning air, Clara felt something inside her chest break open, not with pain, but with a joy so complete it left her breathless. "A daughter," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the tiny, perfect form on Clara's chest. "She's beautiful, Clara. I can feel in the way she moves, the strength in her small hands." Clara looked down at their daughter's face, pink and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. But these were not tears of sorrow or shame. They were tears of wonder, of gratitude, of love so fierce it threatened to consume her. "She'll never know," Clara whispered, touching her daughter's soft cheek. "She'll never know a world where her mother was thought unworthy of love." They named her Hope for what she represented, for what she had brought back into their lives. As summer deepened into autumn, Clara watched Thomas with their daughter and felt her heart expand beyond what she had thought possible. He carried hope everywhere, talking to her in soft tones about the world they would explore together. "Feel this, little bird," he would say, guiding her tiny fingers to touch the bark of an old oak. "This tree has stood here longer than your mama and papa have been alive. It knows stories we'll never hear, but we can feel its strength." Hope seemed to understand her father's gentle lessons. At 6 months, she would reach for the sources of interesting sounds. Wind chimes on the porch, the cats purring in sunny spots, the musical lowing of cattle in the distance. She was learning to see with her hands and heart, just as Thomas did. One afternoon, as Clara sat on the porch watching Thomas show Hope how to feel the different textures of flower petals, she realized something had changed in her. The constant awareness of her scars, the weight of self-consciousness she had carried for years, had somehow lifted without her noticing. "She feels the rose differently than the daisy," Thomas was explaining to Hope, who gurgled happily in his arms. "Soft and smooth, but mind the thorns. Even beautiful things can protect themselves." Clara rose and walked into the house, drawn by an impulse she didn't fully understand. In their bedroom, she stopped before the small mirror that Thomas had never removed from the wall, the one she had avoided looking into since her arrival. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her eyes to meet her own reflection. The woman looking back at her was not the broken, frightened creature who had fled in the night 2 years ago. Her hair gleamed with health, pulled back in a simple style that Thomas loved to touch. Her body had rounded with motherhood, full and strong and capable. And her scars. Clara raised her hand to trace the marks on her throat, the web of pale lines that told the story of her survival. For the first time, she touched them not with shame, but with something approaching gratitude. These scars had led her here, to this life, to this love. They were not marks of damage, but signs that she had endured, that she had been strong enough to survive until she found her way home. Behind her, she heard Thomas's footsteps and Hope's happy babbling as they came inside. "Clara," Thomas called. "Where are you, my love?" "Here," she said, not moving from the mirror. "I'm right here." He appeared in the doorway. Hope balanced on his hip and seemed to sense the significance of the moment, even without sight. "What are you doing?" "Looking," Clara said simply. "Really looking for the first time in years." Thomas crossed to her, his free hand finding her shoulder. "And what do you see?" Clara leaned back against his solid warmth, their daughter reaching tiny fingers toward the mirror's surface. In the reflection, she saw not just herself but them, a family built from broken pieces, made whole not by the absence of scars, but by the presence of love that ran deeper than any wound. "I see a woman who is loved," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I see a mother. I see someone who survived everything that tried to destroy her and found something more beautiful on the other side." Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I see that too," he whispered. "I've always seen that." Outside their window, the first leaves of autumn were beginning to turn, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. Hope reached for the dancing shadows on the wall, her laughter bright as birdsong, and Clara understood that this was what healing looked like. Not the erasure of pain, but the transformation of it into something sacred. As the seasons turned and their love deepened into something as enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley, Clara knew that some stories don't end. They simply become the foundation upon which new stories are built, each one more beautiful than the last.